Young people want that. They want the real thing. And we shouldn't settle for, well, you're kind of a spiritual person, keep seeking. No, they want something nourishing. And the Benedictines can give it to them.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director. What can Saint Benedict, a 6th century monk, teach us about evangelization today? Well, that's what you'll find out in today's discussion with Bishop Barron. Bishop, it is good to be with you as always.
Hey, Brandon. How's life in Orlando?
Life is very well. I want to talk about two really interesting conversations you've had. One of them was your participation in this event called the Big Think. What was that about?
Oh, yeah. It's sponsored by the Templeton Foundation, and we have a relationship with them now. We're doing a number of things with them. And it's very good. It was very intense, about 2.5-hour conversation. And we talked about, as the title suggests, a lot of big topics. One was forgiveness. The whole theme of forgiveness coming up out of the New Testament, how that affects our lives today, questions of nonviolence and justice and all that. And then we got deeply into God. So they were very interested in my writings about God and atheism and what the atheists get wrong and how Christians understand God, the great theological and philosophical tradition around that. And then we got into, of course, the problem of suffering, which you almost always do when you talk about God. We talked about heaven, hell. We talked about a number of just really big, deep ideas. And it was good, long, intense, and that'll be coming out, I don't know, sometime soon.
We'll definitely have a link to that when that comes out. Another great conversation you had was as a part of our Bishop Barron Presents series, which we're ramping back up. This is where we bring, cultural influencers and thinkers and authors and movers and shakers to Santa Barbara to have a long conversation with you. And you recently had the author of the book Strange Rites. Her name is Tara Isabella Burton. We actually did a Word on Fire show discussion about this book a few months back. How did that discussion go?
It was great. She came in here, and you'll see now with season 2, we have a new kind of set with a table. It's the first time we did around the table. And I was delighted with the conversation. As you say, I like that book a lot and think it's very interesting. As I said to her at the end of the conversation, to me, it was a very hopeful book at the end of the day because she shows that even among the nuns, you don't have simply a barren, atheistic sort of landscape. You've got a pretty richly textured religious landscape, for want of a better term, meaning people are reaching out to the ultimate, the transcendent, along all kinds of different paths. And so it might look like just a farrago of wild, crazy ideas, but I think she sees in it, and I agree with her, there's some ground for hope there. So look forward to watching that conversation.
Well, I want to shift our attention back to the great Saint Benedict. You've had a lot of Benedictine things going on in your life lately. You recently gave a little retreat to a bunch of Benedictine abbots from around the country. And you're also, I think pretty soon, in a couple weeks here, giving the commencement address at the great Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. We'll talk about that after it happens. But I want to talk about this message you gave to the Benedictine abbots. You were looking at various aspects of the Benedictine life that are important for the re-evangelization of society. And I thought it was so good and also applicable, not just to Benedictine abbots, but to Catholics everywhere. These evangelistic principles we can pull from the life and work of St. Benedict. So let's begin briefly maybe by exploring your own history with the Benedictines. I believe that attraction began early, right? When you were a teenager, you read the memoir of the great Trappist, Thomas Merton. But talk about the origins of your familiarity with Benedictine spirituality.
That's probably the beginning of it, right, which I've talked about many times when I read The Seven-Story Mountain. And, of course, as a Trappist, Merton belonged to the reform of the Cistercian order, and the Cistercian order was a reform of primitive Benedictinism. And so Merton's world is basically a Benedictine world. The second connection was, as a high school freshman, I was with the Dominicans at Fenwick High School, and I really got my vocation from them because I first heard about Thomas Aquinas. But then after my first year, for a variety of reasons, I went to another high school called Bennett Academy, and that was associated with the Benedictine Abbey in Lisle, Illinois. So right away, I was then in the presence of a lot of Benedictine monks, and I remember the liturgies out there on Sunday. I was invited to serve sometimes. It was a great kind of privilege to be able to serve that Mass. And I loved it. I found it very moving. And then maybe the most powerful in a way, it was right before my priestly ordination. So we're in the spring of 1986. And I am going on my pre-ordination retreat. And I went with a buddy of mine who had gone to school there at St. Meinrad Abbey, which is in far southern Indiana. And Meinrad had and has a large community of monks, and they're really known for their liturgy, and especially their sung office. Well, it's burned in my memory. It was my first morning there. We had arrived at night. I'd never been there before. I was staying in a guest house someplace. And I had to make my way very early, of course, to the church. And I got up, I think I overslept and I was a little bit late. And I made my way through, I can still see it in my mind's eye, a very misty sort of morning. And I made my way up to the side door of the church and I opened it up. And suddenly there was this warm, like, golden light coming from the church and the voices of the monks. I walked right into one of their psalms. And to hear, not on a record, like, oh, listen to these monks, from Europe or something, but right in the heartland of America, my own country, to hear this gorgeous chant of the Psalms. And it kind of electrified me, I must say. And I've never, this is in a good way, I've never gotten over it. I've, from that moment on, just been very taken with the Benedictine manner of life and style of prayer. And then much of my life, Brandon, up until recent years, because now as a bishop, I go with my brother bishops on retreat. But almost every year of my priesthood, when I went on my yearly retreat, I would go to a Benedictine house somewhere. And that was true in our country, whether it's St. Procopius Abbey, whether it's Marmion Abbey, whether it's Meinrad. I went many times on retreat. When I was in Europe as a student, I went to Tamier, I went to Salem, I went to Citeaux itself, the mother house of the Cistercian order. I went on retreat to these Benedictine places. So I've always had this kind of romantic, you might call it, romantic sense of the beauty of the Benedictine life, which is the main reason why I told the abbots, you refer to this retreat I gave, basically, to the Benedictine abbots of America down they gathered in New Orleans at St. Joseph Abbey. I told them one reason I was attracted to that invitation was it had to do with two things I love. One, evangelization, and two, Benedictinism. And so the talk was trying to think those two things together.
Over the years, you've spoken to groups representing many religious orders. When you do, you often encourage them to be boldly themselves. So the Franciscans, you tell them, you need to be the great proponents of Francis and Bonaventure and Duns Scotus, and Dominicans, you need to represent Aquinas and Dominic. You said the same thing to the Benedictines. You said, be Benedictines, but this might be somewhat controversial, so I want you to talk about it. You said, do not become parish priests, be Benedictines. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, and I explained to them, look, I've known a lot of Benedictines over the years who do staff parishes and function as parish priests, and I nothing essentially against that. I mean, sometimes there's a real need and an abbey can serve that. But I said, what I don't like is when I've heard this from some Benedictines over the years. I didn't really know what it meant to be a priest until I was doing parish work. Well, look, I'm a diocesan bishop. I know all about parish work. I respect it. I admire it. I supervise 40 parishes. I have nothing against it. But I said, I always kind of balk at that because Benedictines should say, no, look, I totally get what it means to be a priest precisely as a Benedictine, as a monk, as someone dedicated to the ora et labora of the monastery. And don't, I said to them, fall into the trap, I think, of so valorizing or so romanticizing parish work as though that's what it really means to be a priest. I think by being great monks, they can be of evangelical power. And they don't have to transform themselves into diocesan priests in order to reach the people. Be monks with all that means, I said, and I think you'll evangelize even more effectively.
Let's turn now to several principles of the Benedictine life that are potent for evangelization. And again, I think these are applicable and valuable not just to monks, but to lay people, anyone working in the field of evangelization. The first principle is humility. St. Benedict speaks about humility often in his rule. What's his insight about this virtue, and why is humility necessary for evangelization?
Well, right. Benedict says that the monastery should be a school of the virtues. It's a beautiful description. A place where we learn the great virtues of the moral life and the spiritual life. But what's the most important virtue? No question about it in Benedict's mind. It's humility. He gives us 12 degrees of humility, spends an awful lot of time on it. I think, Brandon, I told the abbots this as though they need to hear it from me. I mean, they know it. It's related to the opening word of the rule, which is obsculta. Listen, listen. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone. Faith, fides ex auditu, Paul says. Faith comes from hearing. Listen. The person of faith listens to a higher voice, a voice beyond his own voice, beyond the voices of those around him in the culture. He listens, attends to the higher voice. And that is humility, it seems to me. The prideful person says, it's my voice that matters, right? It's my plans, my project. I'm in charge here. The humble person sets that aside, sets his own will aside, and listens to the voice of God and subjects himself to the will of God. So that's at the very heart of the monastic life. It's the heart, ultimately, of the spiritual life. And it's what an evangelized person looks like, right? If you've been evangelized, you've heard the good news. Mind you, you've heard it. Faith comes from hearing. It's been preached to you, the good news about Jesus. And now you know, well, my life isn't about me, it's about him. He's the risen Lord. And so humility is deeply related to evangelization because the prideful person can't really be evangelized. So I was saying how the monastery should become a school of particularly of this virtue, that people would meet these monks who have dedicated their lives to listening to the higher voice. That has enormous evangelical power.
Another Benedictine principle you highlighted was justice. Under this umbrella of justice, you included the common good, care for the poor. To a society so often predicated on buying and selling and owning, how can the Benedictine stress on poverty and the common good generate real evangelical power?
I said to the abbots, it's related to John Paul II, that key to the new evangelization is the church's social teaching. And I think that's really a very legitimate instinct. We will evangelize when people see this kind of radical way that we live. So it's nothing against the market economy. The church favors the market economy. But a market economy that is circumscribed legally and morally by all sorts of restrictions, because it's meant to push us in the direction of love, right? Everything comes under the aegis of love, including and especially our economic life. Now, take a further step. Are there some people who are called, not everybody certainly, but are some people called to a hyper-radicalized version of this? Yes. Namely those who say, I'm surrendering any claim to private property. I'm giving what I have to the community. There's nothing that I own. Everything is owned in common for the common good. Well, that's what you see in a monastic context. Benedict is very strong on this, that this, he calls it this evil of private property. And again, he means in the monastic setting. So we're not talking about communism here on the grand scale, That the evil of private property, this is mine, right? That must be eradicated from the monastery. So in the very radicality of this form of life, we're meant to see something new, something different, something that gets our attention, right? And maybe shocks us out of our self-preoccupation, our obsession with what's mine and building up wealth and riches. I remember one of the abbots, we had a conversation afterwards, and he goes, well, we're not recommending abjection. And that's true. Like, you're not saying, I will only be a monk if I live in abject, poverty. No, it's this keen sense of the common good, that whatever I have is for the sake of the whole. I think that has enormous evangelical power when people come and they see this radical form of life. I think I reminded them too of the great Cardinal George remark about pacifism. I think we've talked about it, where the Cardinal said, look, I'm glad there are some pacifists in the church because in their radicality, they remind us of what life in heaven will be like, right? When we can put away our swords and put away all violence. But he also added, I'm glad not everyone in this world is a pacifist. But there are some, just as I'm glad there are some celibates in this world who remind us of the way we will love in heaven. But I'm glad not everyone's a celibate. So I'd say in a similar way, I'm glad there are some people that live this really radical form of the common good, that they surrender private property. Now, follow Cardinal George. I'm glad not everyone lives that way. Not everyone's called to that. But the monks are, and they're meant to wake us up to a new possibility.
Let's look at another key Benedictine principle, and that's the cultivation of beauty. You said, and I'm quoting you here, Benedictine houses are usually in beautiful places and marked by beautiful art and architecture. This is not insignificant, evangelically speaking. Why is that so?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny, Brandon, maybe the one exception I can think of in all my wanderings around the Benedictine world might be Citeaux itself. The Cistercians are known for their kind of austerity. And Citeaux, where Bernard and company, founded the Cistercians, is in a just very kind of flat country. It's near Dijon in France. The church building itself is not very remarkable. There's not a lot of artwork. But that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Otherwise, gosh, everywhere I've gone in the Benedictine world, Einsiedeln and Tamier, and then you go to San Anselmo in Rome, and they're beautiful. They're beautiful locations. They're beautiful buildings and architecture. As we've often said, of the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, maybe the beautiful is the least threatening. Just look. Like if there's a non-believer who's maybe vaguely interested in the faith, and maybe they're not real argumentative, they're not intellectual types, maybe just bring them to a monastery. Just show them, look at this place. And then bring them in, as I had that experience long ago, just to come into the church, beautifully appointed church, while the monks are singing the Psalms. There's an alchemy there. Something's going to happen to you. Something will change in you. Just watch, participate in the beauty of the liturgy. I go back, Brandon, in my mind to that story about James Joyce, born and raised an uber Catholic, but then, he falls out with the church and has this really ambiguous relationship with the church. But yet they say Joyce, as an old man, would slip into churches in France or Switzerland where he was, just to participate in the Triduum liturgies, which he knew as a kid. And they still would have been, of course, in Latin in those days and all that. So he would have known them wherever he was in the world, because he just wanted to bask in the beauty of the liturgy. Well, Benedictines know all about that. And I think to make their monasteries oases of beauty, that'll have enormous evangelical import.
A lot of times when people think of the Benedictines, they think of prayer and work, they think of the Benedictine spirituality, they think of the beauty of chanting Liturgy of the Hours, but it's sad to me that I'm not sure a lot of people would immediately connect Benedictines with the intellectual life. But you emphasized in your talk to the abbots that we're hemorrhaging young people from the church very often for intellectual reasons. We know that from the surveys. Yeah. And so this is what you said in response. And again, I'm quoting you. Do most young people realize that Benedictine abbeys were the places where, quite literally, the wisdom of the ancient world was preserved, where Western civilization was maintained? Do they know that without Benedictine monks, the intellectual heritage from which the university system and indeed the sciences emerged would not have survived? How do we need to recover this Benedictine intellectualism?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to them, I suppose, and I just encourage them along those lines. It's still a staggering truth to me, and as you repeated my words to me there, I was
that sounds good.
Struck.
Whoever said that was very...
No, I was struck by the truth of it. It's simply the case, isn't it? Whatever we know from the classical world, think of all these texts. Think of what was lost. I mean, that's That's also an interesting thing to reflect on, how much was probably lost from the ancient world. But whatever we've got, we got it because patient Benedictine monks over many, many centuries, long before the printing press, laboriously copied out these texts. The commitment to the intellectual life that was there from the beginning of monasticism and eventually flowered as the universities. So now by the late 12th, early 13th centuries, when the universities were emerging, that's unthinkable apart from Benedictine houses. And then take the next step. Out of those universities came the physical sciences, as you and I have said many times, And so the intellectual world in general, not just the religious intellectual world, I mean science and everything else, owes an enormous debt of gratitude to Benedictine monasteries. As I say there, how many of our young people even know that, would ever sense that these descendants now, these daughter houses and granddaughter houses of these ancient places, that's where it happened. And so I told the abbots, get your own monks, your best and brightest monks, and get them geared up, get them doctorates, and get them really into theology, because centuries ago, it was monks copying out ancient texts and commenting on them. I said, now it's probably the internet and engaging young people with questions and carrying on the intellectual tradition in an evangelically indispensable way. I said, of course that should belong to the Benedictine community.
Let's talk about two final principles of Benedictine life that are evangelically powerful. The next one is the importance of community. It's almost become a cliche to observe that we live in a depressingly lonely society, yet one of the most significant aspects of Benedictine spirituality is an openness to not just community, but especially receiving guests. What can we learn from Benedictines on this front?
Well, I think today I told the abbots this, it's the oasis idea again. They have that marvelous tradition. And I benefited from it personally all over the world, where I've been received in Benedictine houses with great hospitality. One of my great memories, it was at Citeaux, this classic ancient place. And I was received there by the abbot, and he washed my hands. And that's in the rule. That's in the old rule that the guest's hands should be washed when he comes into the refectory. I remember, too, that night, I was finishing up my doctoral work. I was there with a friend of mine, a monk, Benedict from St. Anselm's Abbey here in New Hampshire. And we were finishing our doctoral work, and we were received there. Then the word came down to us from the abbot that he invited us to speak to the community about our respective doctoral dissertations. And it's one of the great memories of my life. It was with some trepidation, because it was, of course, all in French. But going into this, I think it was the refectory or some chapter room, and all the monks of Citeaux were there. And I think, here are the descendants of St. Bernard, And I, laid out the outline of my doctoral paper. And my point there is the hospitality with which I've been received all over the Benedictine world has been a marvelous thing. And I said to the abbots, think of the young people that are searching, they're lost, they're angry at the church, whatever. Your outreach to them to let them participate for a time in your community as a daily visitor, as a weekend visitor, as a retreatant, I said that can change someone's life. And you should make these oases very available to people. And I said, think of me walking, I was a seminarian about to be ordained, but still, I'm 36 years later, still profoundly moved by the memory of that experience. So keep those Benedictine arms wide open to receive guests.
Well, the final encouragement you gave the Benedictine abbots was to be masters of the spiritual life. You shared your deep conviction that the armies of young people that have drifted into these weird, syncretistic, anti-institutional forms of religion. We were just talking about Strange Rites, that book, which chronicles this exact phenomenon, that many of these young people are starving for the real thing. That's what they're hungering for, but they need masters who will guide them. How does Benedictine spirituality help here?
In every way. I told them, it's, of course, Pope Benedict, who takes his name from this great saint and this great tradition, where he said, look, what people want out of priests, finally, is a master of the spiritual life. So priests are a lot of things. We're administrators and we're evangelists and we say the Mass and we visit the sick and all those things. But finally, he said what people want. They want a sense in you that you know what the spiritual life is about, that you know how to guide people on the path to God. And I said to the abbots, look, you've got the greatest tradition in the West of spirituality. Centuries of some of the greatest spirits who know the path to God and how to draw people into it. And I said, when the young people come to your monasteries, that's what they want. So when you welcome them and you bring them to the liturgy and you invite them to, eat and drink with you and so on, but realize what they're hungry for ultimately is, call it spiritual direction. That they want to know the path to God. I think here of a great Benedictine like Columba Marmion, who's a 20th century master of the spiritual life. All these dynamics that govern our journey into God, our walk with Christ. And someone like Marmion, who draws on John of the Cross and draws on the Scripture and draws on Aquinas, but gives it a very high level of articulation. Young people want that. They want the real thing. And we shouldn't settle for, well, you're kind of a spiritual person, keep seeking. No, they want something nourishing. And the Benedictines can give it to them. So don't set aside our own extraordinarily rich spiritual tradition, but learn it and share it and propagate it.
Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Today, we're hearing from Ian, all the way up in Vancouver, Canada. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, you can send it in to us, record it on any device at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, Ian is asking about a personal practice in Bishop Barron's own home. So here's Ian.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Ian Kent, and I am from Vancouver, BC, Canada. I heard in one of your podcasts recently that you do your own dishes. Is that actually true? Because isn't there some guy like me hanging around saying, here am I, Bishop Barron, let me do your dishes, let me serve you? And if not, how can I sign up for that?
Good, thank you for that question. Yeah, it is true. I live in a house. The bottom floor are the offices for the region, and I live up on the second floor. And Father Steve Gruno, who runs Word on Fire, lives there with me. And I'm out and about a lot. So I'm traveling, or I'm on the road, or I'm now confirmation season, I'm eating out a lot. But during COVID especially, like most people, I was home much more often. And Father Steve is a good cook, and he makes, not fancy, but they're good, simple, nutritious, healthy meals. And we kind of cut a deal that he would do the cooking, because I don't know how to cook, but I'll do the dishes. And I like doing dishes, and I think I know why. My life is kind of cerebral, I'm thinking and writing and speaking and preparing, and I go to meetings, and there's something about this simple kind of repetitious quality of doing the dishes. You don't have to think about it very much. It just appeals to me. And you get why in places like monasteries, that kind of simple, repetitive work fits in very well with a life of prayer. And it's funny when you ask that question, I'm reminded when I was a kid, I didn't do dishes. My mother did that when I was a kid. But my job around the house growing up was cutting the grass. And we had a big yard, front yard and backyard. So it took, hour and 20 minutes to do it. But I think what I liked about it, I was outside, so it's summertime, you're cutting the grass. And it's very repetitive. You kind of go around the outside, then you do the next row in, you go around. And I'm not joking when I say this. When I first started reading people like Thomas Merton, and they're talking about contemplation, I thought a lot about cutting the grass. Simple, repetitive, gives you a lot of chance to sort of think and muse, or even kind of turn your mind off. I'm just doing this thing. And see, something else will tend to surface when you turn the calculating Cartesian mind off. You shut that down, something else tends to arise. Well, it sounds over dramatic maybe, but doing the dishes is similar to that for me. It's simple, kind of mindless, repetitive work. It involves your hands, it involves your body, and it allows the mind to kind of shut down and for deeper things to emerge. So yeah, I do the dishes, and I kind of like it, actually. I don't know if I'd give you that job if you if you applied for it, because I think it's good for me in a lot of different ways, but I do appreciate the offer.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'd like to encourage everyone to check out our YouTube channel and watch this new video we just released called The Making of a Catholic Priest. It's a new short film we have telling the story of Father Stephen Gadberry. You might know Father Gadberry because he's a fellow of the Word on Fire Institute. He's taught course in there. But this film tells his really amazing journey to the priesthood. Bishop, I know you've known Father Gadberry for years. Do you want to maybe say a word about him?
Oh, he's a great guy, yeah. He studied at the NAC, although I didn't know him at the NAC. I was there twice, and he was in between those times or after, I forget. But I met him through our Word on Fire connections, and just a marvelous guy. I mean, he's got so much going on intellectually and spiritually, but also physically. He's a great fitness guy. He was on the American Ninja Warriors. I mean, that's pretty high-level attainment. And marvelous, balanced, very healthy human being. And a great man of the spirit. So I'm a big admirer of his.
So again, check out the new film. It's called The Making of a Catholic Priest. Especially consider showing it to some young men. Maybe you have sons, grandsons, nephews, young guys at your parish. Send them a link to this video because I think they'd really enjoy it. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.